On the morning of May 12, 2026, a 2-year-old bird lifted off from a stretch of coastal forest near the town of Oric in the far north of California and started flying. She didn't stop for 4 days. By the time she was done, she had covered roughly 380 miles, north past Redding, up and over 2 mountain wildernesses, and across a border into a sky that had not held a single free-flying bird like her in 122 years. Nobody sent her, nobody guided her. The people who had raised her could only watch the signal from the transmitter on her wing and try to understand what she was doing. Her name, as far as the records go, is B9. And what she did over those 4 days is something the conservation world had been waiting more than a century to see. Here's what makes it strange. B9 wasn't escaping anything. She wasn't driven out by hunger or weather. She was a healthy young bird living in the territory she'd been released into, with food and safety and her own kind around her, and she left anyway. She pointed herself at a place no living condor had ever been, flew nearly 100 miles a day to get there, touched the northernmost edge of her journey, and then turned around and came home. The biologists who track her are honest that they can't fully explain the why of it, but they can tell you exactly what it meant. Because the ground she flew over wasn't random. It was a map drawn long before she hatched. The old range of her species, the territory her kind had been erased from a century ago. B9 wasn't wandering, she was reclaiming. And to understand why a single young bird crossing into one American state made headlines across the country and brought a native nation to tears, you have to go back to how this animal was nearly wiped off the earth entirely, and to a promise a group of elders made more than 20 years ago. This is the Sylvan Earth, and this is the story of the California condor, the largest flying bird in North America. A creature that came within 22 individuals of vanishing forever, and of the native tribe that spent decades and staked part of its own identity on bringing it home. But before we get to B9's flight, you need to understand 2 things. What this bird actually is, and what it means to the people whose ancestral skies she flew back into. Start with the animal, because almost everything people assume about it is wrong. The California condor is enormous. Its wings stretch close to 10 feet tip to tip, wider than almost any other bird on the continent. It can ride a thermal for hours without a single flap, covering 100 miles in a day, which is exactly what B9 did. From the ground, a condor overhead doesn't look like a bird so much as a small aircraft. And it is a scavenger. It eats the dead. That fact has made people recoil from condors for centuries, but it's precisely what makes them matter. A condor is part of nature's cleanup crew. When a large animal dies, condors and other scavengers strip the carcass down fast, before it can rot in place and breed disease. Remove them, and dead animals linger on the landscape, and the things that spread from rotting carcasses spread further. A sky without condors is a landscape that cleans itself more slowly and less well. But here's the cruel twist in their biology, the thing that made their near extinction so hard to reverse. Condors are some of the slowest reproducing birds on Earth. A pair nests only once every other year. They lay a single egg, just one, and it takes more than a year of constant parental care before that chick can survive on its own. Most animals answer a population crash by breeding fast. The condor can't. It rebuilds at a crawl, which means every single bird, every egg, every flight carries weight far beyond one animal. And in the 20th century, that fragile, slow-breeding giant ran headlong into us. As settlers spread across the West through the 1800s and into the 1900s, the condor was shot and poisoned and starved. Poisoned sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident, and increasingly by a threat that still haunts the species today: lead. Condors feed on carcasses, and carcasses shot with lead ammunition carry fragments of that lead. A condor swallows it, and it slowly poisons the bird. Lead remains the single greatest threat to condors to this day. On top of that, the large game and the marine mammals the condors depended on for food were themselves being hunted out. So the birds were hit from every direction at once, shot, poisoned, and quietly starved of the carcasses they needed. They collapsed. Condors had once ranged all the way from British Columbia down into Mexico, across the whole western edge of the continent. By the early 20th century, they had been squeezed into a small pocket of southern and central California. The last documented condor in the far north of the state was killed around the turn of the century. In Oregon, the last wild one was seen in 1904 in a small town called Drain between Eugene and Roseburg. And then, nothing. The northern sky simply went empty. And the decline didn't stop there. It kept going all the way down until the 1980s, when biologists faced a decision so drastic it remains controversial to this day. With only 22 California condors left alive on the entire planet, they made the call to capture every last one. Every wild condor on Earth was taken into captivity, to be bred by human hands, because the alternative was watching the species blink out completely in the wild. For a period in the 1980s, there were no California condors flying free anywhere on Earth. That captive breeding gamble is the reason there's a story to tell at all. Slowly, at the condor's own glacial, one egg every other year pace, the numbers climb back. From those 22 birds, the global population has since grown to more than 600, with around 400 now flying free again across the West. But for one nation, getting condors back into the sky wasn't just a conservation goal, it was an obligation. The Yurok people, whose ancestral lands lie in the redwood country of far northern California, describe their foundational purpose in their own language, a phrase that means roughly that they are world renewal people, fix the earth people. Their reason for being is to help keep the whole world in balance. And the condor, Pregonish in the Yurok language, sits at the center of that. In Yurok tradition, the condor is sacred. It is counted among the first creatures of the world. It is the bird that carries human prayers up to the Creator, because it flies higher than anything else. Its feathers and its songs are woven into the tribe's most important ceremonies, the world renewal dances that are meant to bring the whole world back into balance. So when the condor disappeared from Yurok skies for more than a century, it wasn't only an ecological loss. As tribal members have put it, the loss of the condor limited their very capacity to be Yurok. A central piece of who they are had flown out of the sky and not come back. In 2003, a council of Yurok elders made a decision. Of every species missing from their land, the condor would be the first they tried to bring home. And then they did the hard, unglamorous part. For nearly 2 decades they studied. They tested the landscape for contamination. They built partnerships with federal agencies and parks and breeding centers. They prepared the ground for 20 years before a single bird was released. In May of 2022, that long preparation finally paid off. The first small cohort of California condors was released onto Yurok ancestral territory, under a program the tribe leads in partnership with Redwood National and State Parks. For the first time in more than a century, Pregonish flew over those redwoods again. It was a beginning, not a finish line. A handful of birds in a sky that used to hold many. And every one of them faced the same gauntlet their ancestors had. The lead in the landscape above all. The slow breeding. The simple fragility of a tiny founding flock. The milestones since have come at condor speed. Rare, hard-won, and enormous when they arrive. Earlier in 2026, a pair from the northern flock built a nest in the hollow of a redwood and laid the first egg the Northern California flock had ever produced. That egg failed to hatch, which sounds like heartbreak, and is, but it's also completely normal. First-time condor parents almost always fail on their first try. The fact that they nested at all in a redwood on Yurok land was historic. And then there was B9. She hadn't even hatched on the coast. She was born in April 2024 at a Birds of Prey center in Boise, Idaho, and released into the redwood region only the previous fall. A young bird, new to the wild, fitted with a satellite transmitter on her wing so the team could follow her. And in May 2026, she decided to go exploring. The team watched her signal move in something close to disbelief. From Oric, she struck out east, toward Redding, at the top of the Sacramento Valley. Then she climbed, over the northern Trinity Alps, over the Marble Mountain Wilderness, rugged country that would stop most animals cold. She crossed the state line into Oregon. She pushed north until she was within 8 miles of the city of Medford, the farthest point of her journey, and the deepest a wild condor had reached into Oregon in living memory and well beyond it. Then she turned. She passed over Cave Junction, dropped down the Smith River corridor, swung out to the coastal town of Brookings, and finally crossed back into California, reappearing over the redwood parks that had been her home since release. 4 days, roughly 380 miles round trip, around 100 miles on her strongest days. Some 80 of those miles flown inside Oregon itself, a state whose skies had been condor empty since 1904. The director of the Yurok Wildlife Department, who has spent years on this program, described B9 as an especially curious bird, said she was reading the landscape the way only a condor can. And the program's lead biologist offered the explanation that matters most. This is exactly what young condors are supposed to do. The juveniles range far and wide, learning the geography, before they ever settle into an adult territory. They explore, and crucially, they teach each other. He expects B9 to go further still, and to bring other birds with her. And that is the real significance buried inside one bird's joyride. It's tempting to frame this as B9 recolonizing Oregon. The biologists are careful and honest not to. They've said plainly, this was a flyover. She isn't moving in tomorrow. One young condor crossing a state line is not a population taking root. But it is something maybe more important. It's proof. For decades, the open question hanging over this entire effort was whether captive raised condors, released into a sky their species hadn't used in a century, would actually behave like wild condors again, whether they'd remember in their bodies how to use the full range their ancestors once owned. A bird that just sits near its release site is being kept alive. A bird that strikes out 300 miles on its own, navigates mountain wilderness, finds the old territory and comes home, is something else entirely. That bird is wild, fully behaviorally wild. And B9's flight traced, almost like a finger on a map, the northern edge of the range her species had been violently erased from. She flew the boundary of what was lost and showed it could be reclaimed. The whole northern flock is still small, only around 24 birds flying free in that region. B9 is one of them. But she just demonstrated that the sky between Northern California and Southern Oregon, empty for 122 years, is once again a place a condor will choose to go. Step back, and the scale of this is almost hard to hold. This is a species that was down to 22 individuals, not 22,000, 22. Every California condor alive today, more than 600 of them, descends from that tiny remnant, rebuilt one single egg at a time, by people willing to do the slow work for decades with no guarantee it would ever fly. And it's not finished. The threat that did so much of the damage is still out there. Lead poisoning, from fragments and carcasses shot with lead ammunition, remains the leading killer of wild condors. and it's the reason these birds still need constant monitoring, testing, and treatment to survive. This is not a population that's been saved and released to fend for itself. It's a population being carried, bird by bird, by the people who refuse to let it fall again, which is what makes B9's flight land the way it does. It's a glimpse of the destination. A young wild condor doing exactly what a wild condor is meant to do, over land her species hasn't touched in a century. A signpost pointing at a future where this bird is simply part of the northern sky again, the way it was for thousands of years before we nearly ended it. But the part I keep coming back to isn't the mileage, or the numbers, or even the science. It's the song. For more than 100 years, the Yurok kept singing the condor's song. They carried its feathers in their world renewal dances. They spoke its name, Prego Niche, in ceremonies meant to keep the whole world in balance. All of it for a bird that no living person among them had ever seen fly over their land. Generations of elders were born, lived their entire lives, and died, holding the place of an animal that wasn't there. The ceremony outlasted the bird. The prayer kept its shape around an absence. And then a 2-year-old condor named B9 spread 10 feet of wing and flew back into that sky. The reference exists again. The song points at something real once more. When members of the tribe describe bringing the condor home, they don't only talk about ecology. They talk about physically, culturally, and spiritually restoring their world, about being able, fully, to be Yurok again. A bird carried their prayers to the heavens for them. For a century, there was no bird to carry them. Now there is. And that's the thread that runs through every one of these stories. We tend to imagine recovery as something we engineer, that we plan it, control it, manage every mile. B9's flight says something humbler and stranger. People did the patient, grinding work for decades, the captive breeding, the contamination testing, the 20 years of preparation, the lead monitoring that never stops. They got the bird back into the air. And then B9 did the part no human could. She pointed herself north on her own and flew home to a country her species hadn't seen in 122 years. Not because anyone told her to, but because somewhere in her the map was still there. We didn't bring the condor back to Oregon. We brought the condor back to the edge of possible. And then a young bird took it the rest of the way, the same way she carries a prayer, higher than we ever could on our own. If this changed how you think about what's still recoverable, about whether gone for a century really has to mean gone for good, tell me in the comments. And tell me which lost animal you think we should be carrying home next. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe a sky can fill back up. And subscribe, because there are far more of these comebacks unfolding right now than you'd ever guess, and there are many more of them to tell. This has been the Sylvan Earth. Thank you for watching.